is Jen Kretzer, and I'm the Director of Programs for the Wild Center. I'd like to welcome all of you to the Wild Center this evening and for tonight's presentation, The Grand Saga of the Monarch Butterfly with Dr. Lincoln Brower. The Wild Center is a nonprofit organization working to ignite an enduring passion for the Adirondacks, where people and nature can thrive together and set an example for the world. I would like to thank all of the members of the Wild Center that are here today. It's your support that makes the Wild Center's work possible. And if you're not a member, I invite you to belong to the Wild Center community as we work together to make a better future for the Adirondacks. The Wild Center is not just a museum, but we are a forum where people of all ages and backgrounds can come together to share the story of the Adirondacks as a way to help us explore and appreciate our connection to the natural world. And I can't imagine a better opportunity to do that than tonight in celebrating our year-long collaboration with adkaction.org. It's been an incredible year. We are very, very grateful for the support that they've given us to bring the movie Flight of the Butterflies here to the museum, where thousands, I mean tens of thousands of people have had the opportunity to enjoy it, to build awareness and education around the plight of the monarch butterfly through our on-site education programs and our online through our website. Hundreds of people a day are going to the web page, to our Wild Center website, where we have a special page dedicated to the flight of the butterflies and the monarch butterfly. It gets more hits than anywhere else. We have hundreds of people viewing the page a day and watching all the incredible content. And in fact, tonight we are streaming live this presentation, and we will be archiving it, and it'll be on our website. So hi to everybody out there who's watching from your computer, so everybody can turn and say hi. Hi. And also on the support of the programs and lectures that we've had over the past year, Dr. Chip Taylor, Dr. Ernest Williams, and of course tonight's presenter, Dr. Brower. And all of this was really made possible by this incredible partnership with adkaction.org, and I'm very grateful for that. I'd like to really also thank Marcia Stanley, who has been an incredible spirit in making this theme, the Monarchs, a real reality. I think it was a year and a half ago that she came to me and said, I just saw this movie. I think we should have it at the Wild Center. I was like, okay. She's like, well, let's just do it. And I was like, okay, Marcia, let's do it. And it happened, and she's like, well, let's have Dr. Chip Taylor come. I was like, do you think he'll come here? She's like, of course he will. And next thing I know, Chip Taylor's on a plane. And then she's talked about Dr. Brower. She's been mentioning you for a year and a half, and I, of course, had heard of you. And Marcia's like, well, he has to come too. This is perfect. We have to get more about Dr. Brower and about the Monarchs, and get people planting milkweed, and everyone should have one of the brochures that adkactionproduce.org produced last year, and we still have some we can give away today. And it's been incredible. I was recently at an event where a third grader had it was like a science, it was a farm to school fair, and the third grader had made a whole display about the monarch butterfly, and she was passing out the brochures that adkaction.org had made, and talking about how important it was to plant milkweed. And I was just like, oh my gosh, it's happening. The Marcia's ripple effect and adkactions.org ripple effect. So I am really, really grateful to Marcia for the work that she has done here. It's really incredible. I think there's more milkweed planted in the Adirondacks than anywhere else in all of North America. So today, I would like to just offer an opportunity for Marcia to come up and say a couple words, if you could.
When I look out here tonight, I see doers, and those are the kind of people I like. I have to tell you how lucky we are to have this museum here, because the people at the museum are doers. If you take an off-the-wall idea to them, they don't stop and start telling you why it can't happen. They get enthusiastic and they just make it happen. And this Monarch project is one of several that that our little tiny nonprofit ADKaction.org has done since it was founded, got going about 5 years ago. And it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to me to see what one person can do, what just a few people can do, what a little nonprofit can do, and what a museum like this can do. So I hope that we can save the monarch migration. Looks iffy, but we have to keep trying. So, thank you.
Marcia, on behalf of the Wild Center, I just wanted to present you with some flowers. It's a small token of our gratitude and for your inspiration. Thank you so much. They're quite heavy. I'll carry them for you.
Beautiful, huh? Jim asked you to become members of the museum. If you don't belong to adkaction.org, we'd sure appreciate that too.
So now I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Lincoln Brower. We're very grateful that he was able to come to the Adirondacks. He is a distinguished service professor of zoology emeritus at the University of Florida, and since 1997, he has been research professor of biology at Sweetbriar College. He received a BA degree from Princeton University and his PhD from Yale, and taught at Amherst College for 22 years before moving to the University of Florida. He has authored and co-authored more than 200 scientific papers, 8 films, 2 edited books, and is currently writing his magnum opus on the monarch butterfly. He's had unbelievable awards. There's so many here, but just a couple. The Wilbur Cross Medal from Yale University, the Medal for Zoology from the Linnean Society of London, a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Animal Behavior Society, the Royal Entomological Society of London Marsh Award, and he has served as president of the Society for the Study of Evolution, the International Society of Chemical Ecology, and the Lepidopterist Society. So he's clearly, I'm so excited to hear you talk, Dr. Brower. He's been collaborating with governmental and non-governmental groups and other scientists and private individuals to protect and restore the overwintering forests of the monarch butterfly in Mexico, and is actively promoting the conservation of milkweeds throughout the USA. Dr. Brower and his wife, Sweetbriar Professor of Ecology Linda Fink, live with their 2 lovely German Shepherds, 2 friendly cats, and are surrounded by abundant wildlife in Nelson County, all protected by conservation easements. So please welcome Dr. Brower.
Thank you, Jen. That was such a lovely introduction, and it's so nice to be here and to be sponsored by an organization and this beautiful museum. When I was a young lad, I think one of the great influences in my life was visiting the American Museum of Natural History. And I can tell you from those memories that I would have gone absolutely berserk if I'd seen this beautiful wild center at that point in my life. It's a beautiful museum. It's just so interesting. Well, I know that Ernest Williams has talked and Chip has talked, so that you all know quite a bit about the monarch butterfly. But what I want to try to do in my lecture tonight, which is a great opportunity, and I thank everyone who's been helping, and Tom Curley for his nice, wonderful home that I'm staying with Marcia and Tom in. I want to develop the beauty and the magic of the monarch, and many aspects of its biology are really, really fundamentally interesting science. And then I want to get into the issues of conservation, and one of the things that Ernest and I have been working on for the last several years is looking at how deforestation might affect the microclimate, which in turn is absolutely super important for the monarch. And so we'll look, and then we'll end up on the recent problem of genetically engineered plants, corn and soybean, which is wiping out the habitat of the monarch butterfly on an unprecedented scale. So I'll try to end on some positive notes and make some suggestions. Let me get going here. The title of my talk is "The Monarch is an Endangered Biological Phenomenon." And just to go through that, it's not the endangered species. The species itself will carry on in the Caribbean and South America as a non-migratory butterflies, but the spectacular aspect of their life history of an animal or plant species involving a large number of individuals is threatened with impoverishment or demise. So that is what's happening to the monarch, and I've been warning against this for several years, and unfortunately, I would much rather be proved wrong than right. To give an example of an endangered biological phenomenon, the wildebeests in Africa, with their incredible migration over hundreds of miles as the seasons change. The monarch butterfly is an endangered phenomenon. And the phenomenon of the buffalo actually became extinct. It's just there's nothing left of it. So that is a lost biological phenomenon. And then the next step is for the species to go extinct. And one of the things that bothers me about this slide showing the passenger pigeon history a little bit is that the distribution of the monarch butterfly is almost, of the eastern population that's endangered, is almost coinciding with the passenger pigeon migration, distribution. Now to give you an idea, and I'm sure you've heard this before, monarchs are migrating in the fall around the equinox all the way from as far north as Fargo, even further north, or Maine, going up to close to 3,000 miles. And those individuals live for 6 months overwintering in Mexico, and then they come back in the spring, and the majority of them don't get much further than the Gulf Coast states. Texas is a really important breeding ground in the spring, but milkweeds that are sprouting freshly in the spring now are attracting the butterflies. They lay their eggs, and over about a month's period, a new generation is produced, and then that works its way up into the Great Lakes region, and then eventually they'll work their way back into our region here, hopefully. So here's our beautiful butterfly sitting on Asclepias syriaca, nectaring. Its proboscis is out. It's drinking nectar out of the flowers. Nectar is the other important food for butterflies in general, and it serves as the source of energy that energizes them. The sugar that is in the nectar is converted to lipid, and the lipid is stored in the fat body in the stomach, and then that is used for their life activities, chasing, mating, behavior, and for the monarch migrating these 2,000 miles and another possibly 2,000 miles back in the spring. So to put the monarch in perspective, here is the monarch, and these are her relatives. They're relatives that occur mostly in the old world tropics, and there are 157 species in this subfamily of butterflies, and they're all associated with milkweed plants. And so they're called milkweed butterflies. This plate comes from a beautiful book on milkweed butterflies by Ackery and Vane Wright. Cornell University Press, I think, still is selling it. Now, the plants are called milkweeds because if you break a leaf, there's a system of vessels within the plant that's very extensive, that's completely separate from the vascular system, inside of which cells secrete latex. And latex is full of chemicals, and it's also a glue. And when a first instar caterpillar bites into a milkweed leaf, if it's not really careful, the latex will come out and dry very fast and glue the caterpillar to the surface of the leaf, thus finishing it off. And about 50% of the monarchs on this particular milkweed actually get mired and drowned in the milkweed juice. So the plant is fighting back in the co-evolutionary arms race that goes on in nature. Well, so in the spring then, the monarchs are migrating into the south and breeding, and then the new generation works its way up. So let's ask the question, why do monarchs migrate into the temperate zone? They're tropical butterflies like all their ancestors. Well, the answer is milkweeds. And most people think there is the milkweed that the monarch feeds on, but there are actually approximately 120 species of milkweeds in Mexico and the United States. And almost all of them die back in the fall. So monarchs, as this fantastic evolutionary unfolding of milkweeds occurred, monarchs obviously, I mean, we'll never know because we don't have a fossil record, but it's almost certain that that was the evolutionary stimulus for the evolution of the migration of the monarch, all this food supply developing and evolving in the temperate zone. And so in order to exploit it, they had to migrate north in the spring after freezing weather, and then back in the fall because the plants are gone once the first frost occurs. So here we see an old lady, I took this picture near Gainesville, Florida when I was at the University of Florida. She's twisting her abdomen around. She doesn't have very many eggs left, maybe 20 or 30, and she's going to deposit one on that milkweed leaf. And that milkweed leaf, here's another one with 2 eggs on it. They usually don't lay more than 1 or 2 eggs at a time because of the fact that not only, here's more of the coevolutionary arms race, if they lay 2 eggs close to each other, the first caterpillar that hatches will eat down its eggshell, and then the next thing it does is turn on the second eggshell and eats it. So they're cannibalistic, and so they are sensibly animals, very sensible animals with their own population control. And here you can actually see a first instar that's just hatched and it's eating down its eggshell, but you can also see that there's a hole in the side of that egg. So basically it's eliminated its competition. Now, you all know the life history of the monarch, but it's irresistible to talk about it. In about 10 days or so, the caterpillar goes through 5 stages and develops into a 5th instar larva, about as long as your thumb or little finger. And then it spins up on a silk pad that it spins on a branch or under a milkweed leaf or under a fence or anywhere. And then it anchors this little probe in the back that I'm going to show you in the back. And another day passes and it forms this beautiful chrysalid which hardens up as this beautiful. Now, one of the things really interesting is that, as you're going to see, the monarch is a poisonous insect. It's very unpalatable to birds. So it's telling the birds this warning coloration. The bright color is very obvious on the plant. Why is the chrysalid cryptic? So one of the papers I'm writing at the current time is the paradox of the cryptic chrysalid, because the chrysalid is also toxic. And the question is, why is it cryptic? So we can answer that after the lecture. Another 3 or 4, well, about a week later, depending on temperature, the chrysalid is fully, the butterfly inside, the caterpillar has been transformed through metamorphosis into the adult butterfly, and it hatches out. And here it is, just freshly hatched. And to think that this gentle creature is going to be able to make it all the way to Mexico is just a mind-boggling fact. Now, I want to take a little detour here because I got really interested in when the caterpillar spins the silk button, it has to anchor its hind legs into that button to hang on in order to transform into the chrysalid. Now, think about this. The skin cracks and it works up, and by peristaltic motions it moves up the dead skin, and the caterpillar has to let go of the silk pad to get rid of the skin, because if the skin sticks to the chrysalid, it'll kill the chrysalid. It'll deform it. So the question is, how do they actually do that? Well, here you see a little better close-up. Here are the hind legs of the caterpillar anchored in the silk pad, and it's peristaltic movement here. And here you see the skin is broken and it's working its way up, so it's got to get it off. And here it's just about to get it off, but now you see a new organ called the cremaster, and this pulls out on the base of the chrysalid, reaches over the top of the old skin, and works its way and anchors this post into the silk pad. And so you can really see that. Here's a close-up, but so you can really see it, let's go to an electron microscope. Here's the silk pad, here's the post, and here are these crochet-like hooks, and you can see the silk. So the caterpillar, the chrysalid now is completely anchored into this silk pad, and if it falls off, which it won't do unless something is really wrong, provided it doesn't fall off, it'll metamorphose into an adult butterfly in about a week. So this is a really wonderful example in biology of form and function. And if you look at the hooks on the hind legs of the caterpillar, it has to let go of the skin, and so they're not barbed, whereas the hooks on the end of the chrysalid are barbed because once they anchor themselves, they can't get off it. But the caterpillar absolutely has to get rid of that skin as it's forming the chrysalid. So here, going back, so now you really know when you're looking at this what is actually happening. You were looking at the very tip of the post anchoring into the silk pad. Well, early on when I first got interested in monarchs, when I was at Yale University many moons ago, one of the things that was really interesting was there's a viceroy butterfly which is said to be a mimic of a monarch butterfly. And I'm sure you all know the mimicry story. I don't have time to go into it, but it's a wonderful tale. But one of the hypotheses was based upon looking at collections of butterflies in the butterfly collections at Oxford and London, natural history. And they noticed that certain butterflies bore beak marks on their wings. And they asked the question, why is it beak marked? Why didn't the bird eat the butterfly? And the hypothesis was that the butterflies are unpalatable, and a bird had attacked it, tasted it, found it bitter or something, and let it go. And then they realized that all these butterflies are feeding on milkweed plants, and milkweed plants contain a whole array of biochemical toxins. And so the hypothesis was that the butterfly, as a caterpillar, absorbs the poison into its body, stores them in its wings and its legs and all the scales on the body. So if a bird attacks the butterfly, it can taste these substances and maybe get away because it's chemically protected. Well, one of the things I did early on when we were at Amherst College with my honor students was we managed to get blue jays to eat monarchs. And that's a long story how we did that. We duped them into it. So we're giving this monarch a butterfly that's been reared on Asclepias curassavica, which is the tropical American milkweed. And the bird de-wings the butterfly. It pecks the wings off, usually pecks the legs off, swallows the abdomen and the thorax. And then about 12 minutes later, it's beginning to look a little bit ill. And then 15 minutes later, it's retching off the side of its perch. So I became famous on this issue as Brower's barfing blue jays. That's my one claim to fame. So one of the things we did, we took it to the next step and got some biological assays, just how poisonous is a monarch butterfly. So we raised monarchs on different milkweeds, we ground them up, and then we force-fed the powdered butterfly in a capsule to the blue jays, and I'm happy to say we never killed one of our birds in the process. And so this done gently, the pellet is introduced into the crop, and the bird can't regurgitate it, but within about 12 minutes it gets sick if it's a poisonous butterfly. And what we found was that monarchs reared on this milkweed, the one that you saw earlier, had enough poison in a single butterfly to cause 8 blue jays to vomit. And this one was slightly less toxic, 4.8 blue jay units. So you can see where this is going. 4 blue jay units, 0.8, so a bird would have to eat more than one monarch if the caterpillar had fed on this plant. And then we discovered that some of the milkweeds were completely devoid of poison and were completely palatable to the blue jays. So when you look at a population of blue jays, some of them are very toxic, some of them are not toxic at all, and a lot of them are in between. Well, in the height of this research on the chemical ecology of the monarch butterfly, there was a National Geographic article in August of 1976 by Professor Urquhart, and 2 of his colleagues in Mexico, Kathy and Ken Bruger, on the 5th of January 1975, discovered the first overwintering site of monarch butterflies, which was a momentous moment in the history of monarch butterfly biology, and as the film is, that you've probably many of you have seen, as documented in that beautiful film that the Canadians made. Well, a postdoc of mine who became a postdoc, Bill Calvert, he came to a lecture and we talked about the recent discovery, and we said, we got to find these butterflies. Let's go find them. And so we started searching for them in the literature, and we talked to Professor Urquhart in the National Geographic, and they wouldn't tell us where the butterflies were overwintering. They refused to tell us. And so Bill and I got out a bunch of National Geographic maps, and there were 2 clues in the article in the National Geographic magazine. One was we were huffing and puffing at 11,000 feet altitude, and the other was in the northern part of Michoacan. And if you huff and puff at 11,000 feet altitude, you're within about 30 kilometers of where the butterflies overwinter. So Bill took off on the 26th of January, 1976, and discovered the butterflies on the 28th. And then a month later, we went down and joined them. So that was a transformative moment in my life when I first saw those butterflies, which I did in 1977. And since then, I've been focusing much of my research on the ecology and conservation of the whole butterfly phenomenon. So one of the ways in which we located colonies, and you can tell this was a highly unsuccessful moment, one of our colleagues is holding a butterfly pressed between plastic and asking the local people, and you can tell from looking at that picture that nobody had a clue and probably never seen a monarch in their entire lives. We never came across anybody who had voluntarily seen the monarch butterflies. When we had some of the older people working for us up at camp, one old man said his grandfather used to take him up to see the butterflies. But we never have been able to get a hard information on anybody in Mexico ever seeing the monarchs or recording it in literature. Well, later in January that year, I went with several colleagues to Mexico. We drove in and we camped out and we walked down into the forest, and guess who we encountered in the butterfly forest but Professor Urquhart. And this is the moment on the 22nd of January, and he was not happy that we had another story, another night. So as time went on, we found many different overwintering sites. And one of the ones that was most beautiful is on this mountain called Cerro Pelon. And there's a possibility that we may be able to buy this area. It's hopeful, I'm not sure it'll happen. But anyway, these mountains go up to a little over 11,000 feet high and covered with coniferous trees. And this is a volcanic plain called the Llanos. And every one of the areas, the big areas where monarchs overwinter, there's a Llanos associated with it. And one of my recent hypotheses is that they use that as a visual cue to find their way back to the area that they've never been to before. So the National Geographic article and all the other articles that the Urquharts published never gave the location of the site. And about a year ago, I went to Texas and talked with Kathy Brugger, who has since moved to Texas. And from talking to her, I think where they found the butterflies was directly on the other side of this mountain. We're looking at the south-facing slope here. Ernest and I have done some really nice research in the forest here. And so I hypothesized that it was on the other side of that mountain there. Now, about 2 months ago, Kathy Brugger and Bill Calvert and I and John Christian, who was the one holding the butterfly, met up at a meeting in Texas to get together a reunion. And Kathy was there. Ken has long since died. And I put this slide up. This is where you were just looking at was on the other side of this mountain. We were looking this way. Now we're looking back from the west. And this has been deforested, and I'll talk about that later. But Kathy was in the audience, and I took my pointer, and I said, Kathy, point to where the butterflies are, if you know. That moment when we finally knew where the butterflies were. And what's really interesting is that they've been there almost every year since they were discovered, 1975, in that very same spot. Well, field camp, for several years we joined up with Mexican colleagues. We camped out and spent weeks there with graduate students. Let's now look at the geography of the migration in a little more detail. Obviously, we all know where we are. So we're in the Appalachians. There's a migration along the Atlantic coast in the fall. But most of the butterflies are migrating down through the Great Plains states, through Texas, and then they get into Mexico, and they follow what's an extension of the Rocky Mountains called the Sierra Madre. And then right about here, and so they're crossing the Tropic of Cancer, which is really interesting. And think about that. They're going back to the tropics. It really is happening. And so they're going, but everybody thought, they're going down there to stay warm. They're really going down there to stay cold. And so anyway, they're cutting across the Tropic of Cancer, and then they turn slightly west, and they end up right there, literally where that pointer is, in an area that's about 30 by 60 miles. And if you look at a vegetation map here, you can see on this map, this would be tropical forest. Brown is scrub forest, and then deserts and so forth. But there's some of these little black areas here, and a couple of them are up here, and one of them's up in Baja. It's only in this area, which is the Oyamel fir forest ecosystem. It's a fir tree that's related to the Douglas fir and to our Christmas trees here. In fact, they look very much like our Christmas trees. And that forest occurs above 10,000 feet, up to about 11,500 feet, in a very limited area of Mexico. And that's where the monarchs are going. They're going into that forest. And here you see the forest in a helicopter shot. This is so-called Arroyo Zapatero. Monarchs formed colonies here for year after year after year. And if you look at this slide, you can see that the greener trees are pines, and they give way to the Oyamel. So this is almost a pure Oyamel forest where the monarchs are overwintering. And so they don't go higher than that because it gets too cold. So they're limited to a very narrow range in elevation. And this is to give you an idea of how big these colonies can get. All this brown cast in this slide, those are all monarch butterflies clustering on the trees. And this is at the Rosario site. Now, I have a colleague, Dan Slayback at NASA, who's really good at GIS, Geographic Information System Modeling, and that colony is shown here, and it's approximately 3 hectares in extent. The U.S. football field is about 0.44 hectares in extent, so it's the equivalent of 6 to 7 football fields, if you can imagine that solid packing of butterflies. This year, so that year there were 3 hectares, and many years there were 3 hectares, and sometimes it was more than 1 colony in this area. This year it was less than half a hectare, and that was the only colony that had significant numbers of butterflies this past year. If you go down in early November, right around the 1st of November, almost to the day, they start coming in, and they start pouring in over the first 2 or 3 weeks of November into December. And the sky is full of butterflies coming in. Here we're looking south. Here you see the volcanic mountains in the background. And this was taken in the Pelon colony. And if you looked at the number of butterflies in just on one branch of this Oyamel fir tree, this is the fir tree that they're favoring. Probably 5,000 butterflies in that bag. It's just an incredible sight. Just to see this is a mind-boggling moment. They also form clusters on cedar trees, which are probably secondary successional trees in that area. But the shape and characteristic of the colonies dependent upon the architecture of the branch that they're sitting on. This is on Oyamel. They also go on pine. And this again is on cedar, where these huge, beautiful displays of butterflies. And when I first saw them, I practically fainted. It was such an amazing experience. But the first thing I noticed was, look how those butterflies are so fresh, like they're mint, just hatched out of their chrysalids, and they've traveled for 2,000 miles. How do they do it? And the answer is they're incredible glider pilots, as well as navigators. And so they can take advantage of tailwinds and not beat their wings up and get to Mexico in practically perfect condition. So here you see the butterflies at the best, all of them as if they just hatched out of their chrysalids. They also form clusters on the tree trunks, and we'll come back to this. It's very dramatic to see them on the tree trunks. They're so thick on it that you can't see the bark of the tree. Between 1977 and 1982, Calvert and colleagues and I found colonies on 9 massifs. And this is sort of a rough map of where the colonies were found. And we'll get more detail, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And they did that by going out, searching, asking people, going to the areas that were above 10 to 11,000 feet, and gradually accumulated the knowledge. Here's Bill on searching. He was a wonderful field colleague. He'd go down there for months at a time, living off camp food. Now this is a terrible picture, but one of the things that Bill developed was a way to walk around it with a measuring tape and a compass and plot the area of the colony and then bring it back and put it in a computer program and get the actual area. And so the estimates of butterflies that we use now to study the decline in the numbers is the total number of hectares occupied by all the butterfly colonies on the 12 mountain ranges that we know they occur on. So it's a rough estimate of the total number, rigorously measuring them systematically every year. They were pretty large numbers of them early on. They're going to be dwindling. We'll talk about that later. But the average of over that 20-year period was about 6 hectares. And if we could go back to the early days, the colonies were bigger, and so that the average would be even higher than that, almost for sure. So one of the questions that's always interested is, why do the monarchs come to these high elevation OML fir forests? Why aren't they going somewhere else? Well, there are a variety of reasons, and this is a satellite image, and the red dots are and you'll notice that almost all the colonies are on the southwest side of the mountain slopes. So let's see what happens. Here's why they're there. This is taken on a day when moisture is blowing off of the Pacific Ocean in the air, hitting these mountains and condensing and bathing the butterflies in moisture. And remember, this is the height of the dry season in Mexico. And this is a wet period with this moist air coming in. The butterflies are just up here to the left. Here you see the clouds forming and condensing moisture on the trees. You can see they actually drink off each other. They don't even have to fly out of the colony. Well, one of the questions we had was, we knew there were monarchs on 12 mountain ranges, and we were really interested in protecting wherever they were. So a group called Lighthawk, or a colleague, was very good at plotting out where we should go and directing the pilot. It was pretty tricky flying at 11,500 feet elevation in the mountains with a small plane, but we did it. And basically this was our colonies. It's so difficult to get into this region on the ground that it's impossible to get in a lot of places. So we wanted to see if butterflies were occurring in other areas. We predicted they would. And here you can see the colony in the Sierra Chinqua, that first slide I showed you. The butterflies are avoiding the treetops, and they're mostly on the OMLs, fewer on the pines. There's a pine and there's an OML. Most are on the OMLs. They really are attracted to those OMLs. Here's another colony that was actually, this was a very difficult colony to find, but we outlined it so you can see it here. And if you look at this, you can see a cast of gray on the tree, and this was actually almost a hectare colony in this very deep canyon coming off of Cerro Pelon. And here's a small colony right in the dead center. Can you see it? Right there. And that was a very small colony. Dan was really good at spotting these things and between the two. So there are 4 challenges to winter survival that we study in detail. Desiccation in the dry season, freezing in the coldest part of the year, predation by birds, and starvation by running out of energy if they didn't get to Mexico with enough lipid in their bodies. If the wildflowers had been killed off and they couldn't find them, then they'll die of starvation. So I'm really only going to talk about these 2 things here, desiccation and freezing. So let's look at the dry. Monarchs are there. So this is from November through March, and then there's no rain at all, and then the summer comes and it's very, very wet. And then the next fall, again, the dry season with occasional storms, but minor storms. The next wet season and the next, so this pattern of wet and dry season, and the monarchs are there getting at the very beginning of the dry season, and as the time wears on, it gets very, very dry. This is looking at the llanos of the 3 governors in the Cerro Pelon area. You can see how dry it's gotten. So the monarchs begin desiccating, and on clear days they will fly out of the colony by the millions. Here you see them accumulating along a little road that's wet. Here you see them all clustered together drinking. They keep their wings open so they stay warm by absorbing heat, because otherwise their temperature would go below flight threshold and they wouldn't be able to fly back to the colony. Here you see, this picture has 7 males and 1 female. This is the female, and you can see her proboscis out drinking water. So having fresh water is another part of the conservation issue there. Now, the next one I want to turn to is, but much to our surprise, in one of our early camping expeditions in 1981, we woke up one morning to this. Here we were camped out at 10,000, 11,000 feet altitude. It started to get overcast, and then it snowed for 12 days on and off. And we were camping. It was pretty miserable. Butterflies were knocked down by the thousands. These were lucky because it snowed on top of them and prevented them from freezing to death. Here you see them in the snow, and the branches break off. This is a branch that broke off, spilling out all these butterflies on the surface of the snow. If the butterflies are out in the open, the temperature drops down and they can't fly. It gets too cold, and then dew forms on the body, and then that dew freezes. And that combination of wetness and freezing will kill the butterflies. So we had witnessed a couple of storms in the 80s, and in 2002, the biggest storm we'd ever encountered in Mexico occurred in January, and 75% of the population of butterflies was killed. And here you see these butterflies were knocked down by the frost, and there were places where they were up to your hip in depth. And it was a very macabre scene, to say the least. So one of the things that we did, and which resolved a long-standing problem, is how many butterflies are in this area. We took measurements of about 150 areas and calculated the number of butterflies per meter squared. And then by knowing 1 meter, there's 1,000 meters squared in a hectare. So if you know the size of the colony, and there are 5,000, so we found there were on average 5,000 monarch butterflies per meter squared. And so if you multiply that by the number of hectares that year, more than 500 million butterflies, 75% of all the butterflies were killed that year. So we're lucky that we didn't have a kill like this last year, which would have added to the low numbers that were already coming back. So we were really concerned about the climate and what causes freezing. And so one of my graduate students, Jim Anderson, and an honor student at Sweetbriar College, and I and my wife Linda have done a lot of work on measuring the temperature at which butterflies freeze. And basically what we're doing here is the butterfly is in a vial, and the wire leading out is a wire that's hooked up to a little temperature probe inside the test tube that holds the butterfly, and the probe is glued to the butterfly, and then the apparatus measures the time at which the butterfly actually freezes. So what you do is you put the butterfly in the vial in a cold bath, and you drop the temperature down. So this is time, maybe up 20 minutes or so. And this is the temperature, and it starts going down to minus 4 degrees below centigrade. And the first butterfly froze at -8. And when water freezes, it releases heat. And the instrument is so sensitive that it measures that jump and spike, so you can tell the exact temperature at which these butterflies are dying. And some of them got down to -16 before they froze. So by doing a large number of experiments, we determined that if butterflies are dry, this is looking as the temperature is dropping down 1 degree, 2, 3, 4, 5. If they go down to 8 degrees below freezing and read the graph, you see about 50% of the butterflies, if they're dry, are frozen to death if the temperature gets down to -8. But then we also discovered that if the butterflies had any moisture on their bodies or wings, that instead of being able to tolerate temperature down to -8, they could only take it down to about -3 or 4. So the really dangerous situation in that mountain enclave is a rainy period that wets the butterflies, followed by early morning clearing, when the clearing lets heat just escape from the area so fast that the butterflies then freeze to death. So butterflies can survive long periods down to -8 if they're dry. If they're wet, they're at risk below -4, and almost complete mortality at -6. And how often do those temperatures get reached in these colonies? Well, we did a lot of research measuring the temperatures at different parts of the colony. And if you haven't ever seen these little gizmos, they're called I-button thermochrons. And you can program these things and put them out in the colony. You can program to measure the temperature and humidity every hour for like 3 months before the thing runs out of battery. It's just a wonderful gadget for doing this kind of research. And if you plot the temperature, this is in an open area near the butterfly colony, and the temperature just bounces around during the daytime between 15 and 20 degrees, a little bit more or less. Gets warmer as the spring wears on. But look at what happens during the night when it gets cold and early morning. In December, it's December and January, the cold months, it gets down to as low as -8, 9 degrees. And that's below the freezing point of the butterflies. But it doesn't hit there very often. But what the microclimate benefits of the forest canopy are really important. And what we studied was that if you're under the canopy, you're safe. If you're in the middle of a cluster, you're a little bit safer. If you're clustering on tree trunks, you're safer. And if you're clustering in intermediate heights, you're safer. And the butterflies are brainy enough that they do all those things to prevent themselves from freezing to death. And this just shows the difference in temperature inside the forest. You can see, and this is outside the forest, it's basically pretty similar to the graph you've already seen. So the fluctuation in the open area is enormous compared to inside the forest. And whereas it's getting down to as low as -5 degrees, -3, -5, -4, those days didn't get, the lowest they got was 3 degrees above freezing. So the forest is a blanket that prevents the thermal heat loss and protects the butterflies from freezing to death. Here you see one of these eye buttons. So Ernest and I and Linda and a couple of students set out to measure the temperature of the butterflies inside the clusters. Everybody asks, are they warmer inside the clusters? Are the clusters are like a blanket to an additional blanket? So we put these eye buttons on dowel rods and gently lowered the dowel rod into a cluster. Now this rod comes out here. You can see an eye button on the bottom of it, which is exposed, and then there are 2 or 3 other ones inside the colony. And what we found was at night it's a little bit warmer, and during the daytime it's a little bit cooler. So being cooler during the daytime is an advantage because you burn up your lipids in proportion to the temperature that you're living in. So cooler days are an advantage, and warmer nights there's a little bit of protection against freezing. Then the next thing we did was based on observations that the amount of mortality on the branches and trunks inside a colony during a big freeze period, and the Chinqua colony in 81 and the Hirata colony in 92, that when a severe cold spell occurred after rain, 56% of the butterflies were killed on the branches, and 78% were, these are still alive. 56% were still alive on the branches, and 78% on the trunks. In other words, the survival rate is higher on the tree trunk during a cold period than it is on the branches. And the reason for that is because the branches are more exposed to the cold air. And the same thing occurred in this. This was a worse, more severe storm. There was only 5% survival on the branches, but 43% on the trunk. So what does that mean? It means that the tree trunk is effectively a hot water bottle, because when it gets cold, it's a very short period of time, and the trunk is stabilized at a temperature well above freezing. So the butterflies that are on the tree trunk get the warmth as it's radiating out of the tree trunk. So that's the hot water bottle effect. And then here you can see the difference between the trunk. This is the graph now to which we've added the temperature on the tree trunk during these cold periods, and you can see it's even more moderated. So it doesn't get anywhere near cold at night, and it's a lot cooler during the daytime. So all these aspects in relation to the OML trees become important microclimatic. So Ernest and I also asked the question of why do monarchs cluster at intermediate heights in the trees, as you've already seen. Well, so to explore this, we put our eye buttons inside of PVC tubes, and we put them on a string and shot the string over the top of the tree with a amazingly big slingshot that nearly decapitated us on a couple of occasions. But anyway, we strung the tubes at 5-meter intervals, so we had a whole series of measurements going up to pretty close to the treetops. And what we found was basically, in summary, that on the ground it's cold and it gets warmer as you get towards the middle of where the colonies are actually forming, and that's about 10 meters off the ground. And then it begins to get cold again as you get above the butterflies. And that's true in a thinned area as well as in a somewhat dense area. So the butterflies are choosing the area in the vertical distribution which is safest for them so that they can tolerate these storms when they occur. So the butterflies are, all these then things that we said, being under the canopy, being in the middle of a cluster, clustering on tree trunks, and clustering at intermediate heights, are all of advantage to the butterfly, and Ernest and I have documented this in detail. So microclimate matters. So here's the first problem of conservation issues in Mexico. When we first went into the area, it was clear that we were driving in on logging roads, and that there were, over the years, we saw them actually cutting down trees that had butterflies on them. So there was no knowledge or respect of this as a phenomenon by the local people. They were just using the forest, and at a fairly low intensity in the early stages. But then commercial logging began on a much bigger scale, which got us really worried. And so we agitated with monarch people in Mexico and in the United States, World Wildlife Fund mainly. And in 1980, there was a decree made which did nothing really. It said protect monarchs everywhere in Mexico, which meant basically it was just hard to do any research on them. Then in 1986, with further evidence amounting, the Mexican president decreed 16,000 hectares total protected. And a core zone, which is sort of like a national park, that was the general idea, surrounded by a buffer zone, which would be sort of treated like national forest. Well, the problem was that didn't stop the illegal logging. It kept going on. And as over the years, 14 separate lumber companies popped up in the middle of this area, and some of them pretty massive, right in the middle of the butterfly area. This was an artificial board factory. So the Mexican government asked us to document just how much deforestation was actually occurring. So we got together a team of Mexican and American scientists, and basically by comparing photographs taken over a 28-year period starting in 1971, 1984, and 1999, the green is really intact forest, the yellow is partially disturbed, and the gray is very disturbed. And what you can see here is that basically something like 44% of the forest was lost over that period of 28 years. And so here are the butterfly areas, and so that you can see that the whole area was being very badly damaged. And the Mexican government was very responsive to that, and they increased the area protected by about 5-fold. And so we tied together the areas where they originally had been so that it was one continuous unit as best we could. Still not enough, but a lot better than it had been before. But what happened after that was another series of illegal logging events occurred, and then in addition to that, this horse logging which goes on interminably, and this whole side of Cerro Pelon where I showed Kathy showing where the butterflies were, that was all damaged by horse logging. Just slow, relentless removal of trees, and this is that side of the mountain. This is the same picture that she had pointed to right there. But you can see this is the remaining forest, and this was all blanketed forest. And monarchs have been in this arroyo so that they form the colony here and they come down this arroyo to migrate out. So this was a very serious business. And then the illegal loggers got going in about 2005 and clear-cut an area. It went on for 5 years. And you can see that there's not much of a chance. This was over an area where there were 2 monarch sites, completely destroyed. So anyway, that was a big problem. The Mexican government has done a lot to stop it now, but there's still horse logging going on that needs to be stopped. And then unfortunately, ecotourism has become overdone. Here you see horses coming up to the Hirata colony. Now 2 years ago I had the honor of leading President Carter up there to see the butterflies, and this was the area. He was appalled by this. And if you walk, it's going up, it says, the sign says along the path up to the colony, no more than 20 people in the colony at one time. We came down, and these were the people. That's the 20 people. There were 22 buses there. So literally hundreds of people kind of have overwhelmed several of the colonies and done a lot of damage to them. And this is Rosario on a busy weekend. Tens of thousands of people have come to see the butterflies. It's a mixed blessing as ecotourism can be if it's not well regulated. And I always thought this was sort of ironic, selling little toy Oyamel fir trucks, leading the trunks of the trees out of the colony for all the children who enjoy. I don't think the Wild Center would do that. Well, this is a slightly more subtle picture taken over a period of 27 years. This was what it was like in 1980, and this is the very same rock in 2007, just completely stripped of all the vegetation, just by too many people crawling over the rock. It just shows the subtle impacts of people over time. Here we are with President Jimmy Carter. That was a wonderful visit. This woman is named Gloria Tavera. She's the new director of the reserve, and she's doing a very good job, and she's very serious about addressing ecotourism. So now I'd like to turn to conservation issues in the United States and Canada, which are focusing on the loss of milkweeds and nectar resources. This is a field at Sweetbriar College, which is typical of many fields throughout eastern North America, with lots of Asclepias syriaca, the common milkweed, growing, and monarchs happily laying eggs and going through their life history. Here's a female, male, it's actually a male, and you can see that milkweeds provide not only the larval food plant and the toxins and all that aspect of it, but they're also an important nectar source. It's really an amazingly wonderful plant for butterflies and bees in general. And not only that, but goldenrods and a whole array of wildflowers. Liatris is another one that's really important, especially in Mexico. Now, in 1998, Wassenaar and Hobson published a paper which they collected monarchs in Mexico, and they analyzed their isotopic content, and from the isotopic content in the butterflies, they could tell where the butterflies had been born. And so they plotted that out, and they found that 50% of the butterflies that get to Mexico are born in the corn belt, in the grassland ecosystem, and in this general area, 95%. And we had some data that agreed with that I won't go into now. So what's ominous is the fact that that area of the corn belt and the soybean belt is exactly overlapping the main breeding distribution of monarchs, as shown in that previous slide. And here you see the two things together to show the degree to which they overlap. Now, in 1994, I did a field trip out to Minnesota, and this is the edge of a cornfield in fairly early summer, and you can see the milkweeds are very happily growing along the roadside, as they still do, and as long as the roadsides are still intact. But beginning about that year, Monsanto released a chemical called glyphosate, and glyphosate is absorbed by the leaves of the milkweed. it's taken in and it kills the roots and the budding parts of the plant, and the plants die. And here you can see this was very early spraying. And so these milkweeds are folding up and they're on their way out. And if they sprayed twice, it kills them for sure. This was a picture taken by John Pleasance 5 years ago. And it's a soybean field. Here are the soybeans. Here is grass growing between them and milkweeds. And so after they're sprayed with glyphosate, kills everything. Milkweeds are dying. The soybeans are happy. Why are the soybeans happy? Because they are genetically engineered to contain a genetic sequence that makes them totally resistant to these herbicides. So everybody, I'm sure you all know this in the audience, that the plants are genetically engineered to be unresponsive to the poison. The herbicide is then sprayed on the plants and everything dies, but the soybeans or the corn are perfectly happy. And this, John Pleasance gave me this slide, and it simply shows that he looked at 150 stems and watched the rate at which they were dying by the end of August. Most of them are on the way out. And we now know that it kills them completely because it kills the root system. And the result of this is a soybean field in Minnesota, and it's an absolute monoculture with nothing growing in it. There's one weed. Anybody know what that weed is? Corn, because that corn plant was genetically engineered to resist it. So we think that this has become, oops, I hit the wrong, that this has become a really serious problem, and that it's one of the reasons why monarchs are going down, 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 down. And this past year they were, not only were the numbers, the total numbers at the all-time low, less than a hectare, but the number of colonies that were occupied was off by about 60%. So I have had privy to a recent paper that's going to be published soon. I can't tell you, 1985 and 1996, so it's a relatively new technology. The number of pounds per year in 1995 that were sprayed was 10 million pounds. By 2013, 204 million pounds. The number of acres in 1995 were 18 million, and in 2013, 158 million acres sprayed with this stuff, killing everything. I think it's a really serious problem. And Ernest and I put together this graph. It's showing the monarchs recently. And here's glyphosate use in these fields. Millions of pounds per acre. So as the glyphosate goes up, the monarchs are going down. Now this is a correlation, it's not a causation. We can't say that glyphosate is responsible for the loss of monarchs. But this paper that I've had privy to makes such a strong case that I think it's more than 99% certain that glyphosate has caused the loss of monarchs that we're seeing now. So here's this very beautiful, wonderful adaptation, migration, overwintering biology. It's unique in the world. There's nothing like it anywhere. And I sort of feel that these gigantic corporations are jumping on a defenseless mouse. And one really wonders what's going to happen. I always thought, we're going to lose the phenomenon, but we might even lose the butterfly from the United States altogether. So I'd need to thank lots of conservation colleagues, my wife Linda, and one of and this fellow was the president of the World Wildlife Fund Mexico, Guillermo Castilla, who was a wonderful shepherder of the monarch, but he's now the head of the tropical areas of all of World Wildlife Fund. So anyway, acknowledgement of funding from many sources, which we appreciate, to say the least. It would be impossible to do the work without the funding. And here we see the monarchs breaking up at the end of March. Here they're headed out on their way back to the U.S. And well, very much, and I'll be happy to answer some questions.